about 15 minutes myself.
I'm used to it. Like, I don't want the smell.
Okay, Kyle, if you can hear and see properly, give me the thumbs up and we'll get started.
Sounds good.
Okay, great. So today is the last synchronous thing I'll do because I want to peel out ahead of time before the end of the semester crunches down on everybody. So I will finish up, I think there's 5, maybe 6 left, and I'll finish up tomorrow and post them. So you can do them at your liberty. And then on Sunday soiree, I will show you how I'd like you to kind of make a book out of them you're going to travel with by placing them into an existing sketchbook. So you've got a rigid paper and a piece of cardboard on the back of the book so you can draw on site as you sort of sit down, and the sketch becomes kind of tabletop so you can kind of complete the artwork. So today's work is, I want to preface it by the period we're in. And one of the most dominant aspects of the period we're in is the School of Architecture, which dominates the culture at the time. So if we do a little bit of a timeline between Louis XIV and then the building of the Paris Opera House. And it's such an important piece by the architect. It's actually referred to by his last name. So Charles Garnier is the architect of the Paris Opera. And that timeline moves from Louis XIV's vision for an academy in France that would start to teach architecture to French people so they could drive their own, to a point where that evolves into the most dominant school of architecture and the arts in the Western Hemisphere. And it's got a relative name to that, the École of the Beautiful Arts, Beaux-Arts. And that's said with a bit of a liaison, like one word where the X becomes a Z, so it reads as Beaux-Arts. And the principal ones are painting, sculpture, and architecture. Some would say architecture is the mother of all arts. If That's sort of from our side. I'm sure the painters and sculptors would disagree. But in that case, by the time Charles Garnier is a student of the École des Beaux-Arts, coming out of that, he had all the formal principles of what the École des Beaux-Arts was all about. And so his competition entry, I think he placed fifth out of the first top 7 that were selected, and then went to round 2 and did a really extraordinary job and won the competition. But most importantly, there he carries on the principles, which was very key for us in the day of this school. Now that school is so dominant from the whole 19th century moving to the 20th century. It is diametrically opposed to its antithesis in the modern movement. And the biggest sort of school building as well as school of thought comes out of Germany post-World War I at the Bauhaus. So basically you have these two contrarian things, one steeped in history and one pushing toward technology and the engineer at odds with each other coming out. And yet many schools in the United States kind of adopt both cultures simultaneously. So for instance, there are still some very procedural schools that are based on the École des Beaux-Arts. Some are very, very technologically oriented, and a lot blends between the two. As a matter of fact, the idea of how we sit in architectural design practice in a studio is the model of how it was taught at the École des Beaux-Arts, where you'd have an architect, a professor, a professional would come in and work with the students as if they were within sort of a small firm in a sense. And so that studio then would have designs that would develop over weeks or months, no matter what it is. It was called a charrette because when you're done, you would roll up your drawings. And a charrette in France is a small cart. And so you would simply put your drawings in the cart, your rolls and rolls of drawing, and bring them to the final critique. Pull this up a little bit so you see the sketch of that charrette. And so today we still use the word charrette as a way of sort of dictating what we're going to do with students in an architectural program, because you can charrette like today. This is a bit of a charrette on the Garnier Opera House. It's going to happen in under 45 minutes. So in a sense, that time then gives you the determination to complete something. So you can do a 2-minute charrette, a 75-minute charrette, a week-long charrette, or like studios are typically in the upper level, sometimes they're 4 and 5 weeks long. And at the end, you sort of like review that, you determine the grade, you determine whether you win the competition. And that's sort of the formulation that came out of the École des Beaux-Arts and is still used today in many schools. So let's talk about the Opera House, which is the jewel of the Second Empire. And so somewhere in here on a timeline, we have the movement between now and the Garnier's opera. We have revolution at the end of the Bourbon family. And then we have the institution of the Republic. And then it goes back to the Bourbon family again, kings, and then back to the sense of Republic. And then finally, somewhere in there after Republic, we have Napoleon. And then somewhere after the last Bourbon king, we have Napoleon III. And he is the benefactor of Paris as we know it today. So from about the 1850s on, he realized that the medieval sense of the city was problematic from a service quality, the quality of life, as well as military protection for the leadership to be able to move armies within neighborhoods quicker. He adapted the boulevard system of Baron Haussmann. And so the whole redesign of Paris, what we know, is really coming out of this section of École des Beaux-Arts and Napoleon III in the 19th century. So even though we've championed the fact that Paris is a very old city and has got many stages from the Gothic and from the Renaissance, from the Baroque, what we see mostly in terms of its presence today is really not that old, coming from the middle part of the 19th century. Now, another key word before we start drawing from all this is the type of stylistic tendencies we're going to see here. And the word for that is eclectic. And eclectic really isn't a style. Eclectic is a brand of many styles sort of interloping together. And so it allows architects to kind of dip into history and pull pieces out here and there and try to create a new type of, almost like a cuisine out of that, as if you're going to mix spices together. It still is heavily based on classical language, or there might be Renaissance associated with the Baroque, associated with a Greek interpretation associated with something from the 19th century version of it. And that's what we see here at the Grand Temple to the Opera, and that's Garnier's Opera House. So you approach on this, the boulevard of the Opera, and you come to obviously a classical elevation that's got sort of a Palladian motif as a frontispiece to it. And so the way that sits in the city, if we use the same diagram here with this long line as an east to west axis, this is the longest running boulevard or street scene or epic walk that you take through the city of Paris from the dawn of the sun to the setting sun in the west. The Arc de Triomphe is on this end kind of receiving the major pathway from the west back to the east lies, and we'll put it over here just for the sake of legibility, it lies sort of a little bit of an U-shaped receiving line of the Palace of the Louvre, the palace of all the kings of France, which open up to the west from earlier courtyards and other developments that kind of moved out here. And today we'll see in a later sketch, right about at this point, we'll see Pay's pyramid right on that axis. So when it came time to develop this opera house for Napoleon III and all the vitality of Paris at the time, because when it's completed by 1870s, Paris is the place to be in Western culture. It had the might, the power, the government, the setup, the architecture, and so the boulevard scheme was working well, trying to define it as a world-class city among world-class cities. So what they had to establish then is what the appropriate relationship, if this is the river here along the edge of the Louvre, what relationship to the center of that Louvre should this be? Is it a complete 90-degree axis over here? Or what they chose to do is once you're out into the court, which is received on the north side of the building, it goes off on a diagonal. And once you reach that piece, you then find yourself at the terminus of that major boulevard, which is the center arch, which takes you inside this master floor plan that Garnier planned for not only the opera itself, but the opera before the opera. Because this was the place where you simply didn't go to see something, you go to be seen. And we're going to draw that part of it because that's the most prolific part of the scheme that he thought about through here. But first, let's talk about the blends of ideas, which was done by Garnier in this almost 2,000 seat opera house, which has the largest stage set. I think you got as much as 400 actors can be on that stage. It's the largest in Europe. So if you look at the model type from the roof plan, you'll see it's actually kind of almost expressive in terms of showing what's happening by its massing. So rather than trying to cloak it into a simple box and make it look like a singular temple, actually the idea of expressing the volume by its function is actually a little more modern thought that comes out of Sullivan later on. And Garnier is zoomed at this point because he has sort of the receiving temple. And in plan here is this major, almost third of the entire volume of an interior volume, almost like you're in a palace on a tri-level staircase and sort of open hall where the city comes to convene. That's before you even enter the rotunda of the actual theater itself. And obviously the fly in set design for operas is a magnificent piece where the stage is on the front center section of it. And then all the subsets of scenography that gets pulled up and down is the rest of the space. So rather than hide that, he celebrates that in the city of Paris. And so to crown that aspect of it, literally, he puts a crown on top of that space where the audience is looking down on the play itself. And then outside of that, two twin wings for receiving on one end, the public by chariot on the other end, the private access for Napoleon and his wife Eugenie at the time. The back end then comes out and splays out to multiple boulevards this end as well on the north end. So what you have is sort of a great dynamic and plan type of how this moves about space, moving people in and through the building. So look here in plan, if you approach this from the south and you're coming from the Louvre, you'll come onto a place out in front of it. So this whole area is called the Place de l'Opéra. And so there's Baron Haussmann type of architecture that comes up and makes it a very broad boulevard. Then you're received by this great colonnaded frontispiece until you make your way into the movement of this major interior environment we're going to look at next and plan. So this will take you into the chamber of where people see people, and then finally to the seating and the stage set that's going to be found inside the fly. Then it steps down to the back part, and finally you get to an administrative block on the north end. And then again, that splays out to the pattern language of what Haussmann had set up for Paris, which he learns from the Baroque architecture of the Bourbon family and places like Versailles and Vaux-le-Vicomte, now stitched into the urban fabric of Paris. So what we'll do is we'll take a view as if we're already inside. And so the way it's set up here is we've come in from a lower archway on the first floor here out in front. And so we're going to come into the space, then we're going to come over to the right and then go down one of the stairs to one of the lower terraces. And then look back up to the grandiose elevation of what that sort of arcaded grid is above us. And from that point, we'll be able to see sort of the quality of the movement of people along this sort of eclectic idea of architecture, which once we're into the sketch more, we'll start to talk about it more than actually draw it, because it's so detailed and so rich in color and sculpture and painting, it's very difficult to sketch in a short amount of time. So because we are beneath the major plinth of the stair that rises up, we're going to look up underneath that. So that's this throw of a diagonal that's going to go through the space from the lower part of the entry to that top tier. So we're going to come down and look back up to that. So the first thing I do is establish that there's a series of arches at the lower level, look back up, and the one closest to us obviously is the largest one. So we'll notate that, and it's big, broad sweep of an arch, hemispherical arch, and is received by a squatter type pier over here. And that springs over to its twin, and that'll launch off of our sketch as kind of purview in terms of 60-degree view shed. Now to support that, because again, once you come to this level, there's one more area that can take you down and beneath the stair. So that's actually vaulted. So we'll start to see the spring point of a central pier in the middle of that stair. So there's a twin to this just off our sketch to the right. And as the stair is thrown from the level that takes you mid-rise to the final height of it, it always seems to move on a curvilinear grace. So there's, even though it's a lot of classical language, it's got a lot of flow to it and beauty, as if you're inside the sculpture or inside the painting and the performance, or inside the opera of life coming to the opera. So if we'll just thicken up some of these throws of the arches that support that, the twin to the one that's closest to us is all the way over here on this edge. So now we've kind of defined the two arches that support the throw of that upper stair. And of course, when you have the rail come down from the upper area to here, it then is returned and comes down and flows with the arc over this side. It's got a very broad handrail to it. And then finally steps down. Right now, we'll start with just a line, but we'll draw the actual treads here when they get closer to us to give some scale to the space. So now to separate us from the edge over here, this is the edge of the sketch, we'll simply take the profile of some of the detail of the wall that's closest to us. And now we're just going to see the other side of the rail that's closest to us come down to the grade here. So that starts to pull this skin of the underside of the whole probably 4-story interior closer to us. And now we'll push back the arcade up above, because you walk beneath like the lowest level of this whole big 4-story volume, and then you're sort of in the center of it so that all eyes can see you on 4 sides as you make your procession there. So you really are on stage as you make your way to your seats. So we'll take the edges of these to make sure there's a definition there. And it's a double column on each of them. And then because we know there's a value change between the lit space we're in and the underside of architecture there, we can take one quick cloak of value just to wash those, to separate that backspace from the interior of the room. We'll do the same thing up above. There's yet another arcade at the highest level. So the highest level of seats up above also come out to this space. And we'll see a very broad, thick arch there come down. And again, it's dark in the distance. Now we do the same thing on the underside here. This receives the less natural and artificial light because we're not only a lower level, we're actually beneath the whole rise of the stair above. So we can take the places where we indicated these arches of support and make that whole area a tone darker. We'll do the same on the other side of this column, and that'll pull that column closer to us. Wash that over. Now, because it's a blend, there's also the types of vaults you'd see in Romanesque or earlier Gothic architecture. So in a quadripartite way, these arch vaults come to a point here that celebrate that. So we'll do a little bit of structure for those, and we'll simply wash that out dark too because it's underneath the stair. And then finally we come to the edge of that throw from the other side, and it will be bright on the other side of that. So we'll put some detail on both sides of this column eventually. But right now our primary column is this one right in front of us. And it'll come down and have some trim beneath our horizon line. Right now, if we count the number of treads up at about 7 inches equal up to about our eye height, they're going to diminish as they rise up in terms of how tall we're going to make them. But at one point here, it'll probably stop at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 is about 63 inches of height. And so right there is the scale of how large this space actually is. So by the same proportion up here, if we move somebody up on the second deck up here and have them come to the edge, their kind of profile probably about that tall in terms of scale. And then somebody walking up the rail looking over, diminished a little bit further, probably has about that scale. So now we've kind of given a sense of just how big this interior environment is, because obviously it's epic for the current emperor of the state of France. So what we'll do now is do some of the definition of this space. And I think what we could do is just start to wash a little bit of the line work for the rest of the stair, get it ever so closer together as you march up. And that's all we really need. It's not obviously the accurate number of steps, but it's an indicator of the movement of people going up. And then we'll come on the other side and we'll show the twin railing to this. This one curves in, so the stair flows open at the base. So this one's going to turn towards us. So the upper edge of that rail, which defines height, is there, and it's twin on the other side of the stair, does the same. As it opens up, you can see it's thicker between these two than it is between those two. And then at a certain point, as we start down the rail on this side, you can start to see the treads on the other side of the stair. So parallel to these are going to show up over here to give some scale and what the actual mechanics are of this idea of twinning stairs around the major one. So there's ways to go up around the major and then also down around the major stair too. So this particular rail over here is darker because it's parallel to the light source. And then beneath it, even darker yet, as the flooring beneath here, the little space, see the least amount of area for us here. Okay, now to help pull this frontispiece of this big bastion, which turns the corner and has a twin up here, then turns again up top, we want to separate it from its back lighter stone that's receiving light. So we're going to make the edge of that darker here and then kind of let it taper off as it moves up, because we don't want that dark to meet this dark. And now we'll come to the little projections that are around the space, because you can always come to any edge here and look at people. Every time there's an opening in the exterior wall on all four sides, that's part of the event of how you're being seen, or you're seeing yourself. So that's open. And now if we wash above that one singular arch I drew right in the beginning, that's the entry level off the street. So that makes that a very big break point here to move from this part of the stair on top of that and then back down to that arch. So there's some lovely detail once you come to the actual skin of these, and we'll just hint at this because once you visit this, you won't believe the incredible opulence here. There was spare no expense, because the theater of this is just the greatest spectacle in the City of Lights. So obviously there's the fascia of all these arches that come along, and they meet with a detail between themselves. So any type of little accent piece, the top of the arches to kind of settle those, and the top of that piece, it just builds on each other piece by piece. At the spring port of the arch, you've got the little cornice line for all those. And finally, around this edge, we see the corner of the room itself after this third arch in the corner behind our person. So at that point, coming off of a vanishing point, if we drew this box, the left vantage point would be on this end, it crops up here. So we see a little bit of that right wall. And so maybe because that's brighter, because it's perpendicular to the street light, right coming up to it, that wall might be a little bit darker. So we see the corner of the box inside the space. There'll be arc of ceiling above that. And now it's a matter of just spending more time and investing more of the language of this incredible design. And so this is probably one of the most photographed just stairways in the world. We haven't even got to the theater itself and why we're here. This is just an accent to get you to the primary space. But obviously, there's more in mind here than just seeing the play itself or the opera itself. So we'll come back in and show a little bit of detail for the dentils on this cornice line, just that little scribble of those teeth coming out. And then little emblems between the arches up there. So you can see where in the lifespan of Garnier, he spent the bulk of this from his youth as a relatively recent grad from the École de Beaux-Arts to manifestation of this 15, 20 years later. And he really doesn't get many other projects outside of another enormous building down in Monte Carlo as well. So we'll come up here to the top because we want to really collect this as the major part of the third. So we'll move up here with our eye ascent. Stairs are always great in interior perspectives because they're movement pieces. You want the eye to travel across a drawing. So when you have a stair, your mind just wants to go up the stair visually. So just by itself, it sort of helps out. But to help us stop it at the top, we want to make sure we're still under something that's darker along this whole edge here to edge the sketch. Let's see, we have a little bit of chip a pencil beneath it there. So this will run down, and that way we can kind of collect some of that dark against the light and just feather that off. And then every piece, it's never so simplistic where two planes meet. There's always trim upon trim upon trim. So we can line this out and show some of that decorative element. When it comes down here, it'll spring into a vault. It's got another pair of lines here. This one doubles up. And so we can throw those all down to this column capital, which itself is enormously decorative and really a sensational piece. The number of craftsmen on the site was just probably the largest scale project in contemporary France at the time. So we'll show that throw, that throw. So all these lines have got more of a thickness and depth to them. They articulate that spring point. And here's how we'll end the sketch with this one up here. We don't want to carry all the dark over here. We want to keep the darkest area right where our sketch is here. So we'll keep building up value more and more in this zone. So as I mentioned, it's eclectic. And so eclectic, if we list the number of things that are happening here, it borrows from many historical sources. So first and foremost, people would say knee-jerk reaction, it's a Baroque building because it's done this heroic stance for governance at the time. But it's also got the classical language of simple palladial gestures within the Renaissance culture blended together. There's axial symmetry, which you saw in plan, biaxial symmetry in the governance here, but also the radial types of ideas, sort of an urbanistic gesture at the same time. So he was planting this into the fabric of the city as he designed the interior spaces. And with that, he actually addresses modern technique. So Napoleon III was very keen on the idea of having really strong technology, state-of-the-art types of things from engineers. So this architecture is really on an incredibly unique type of sub-foundation. Enormously heavy structure, there actually was a large aquifer moving water down where the foundations are. So this whole building, in a sense, is built on a floating raft. So it's taken not with points drilled into bedrock necessarily, but actually relying on the water to make sure the foundation is pure and resist that type of settling or movement when the architecture gets fixed. So it's really sort of a very interesting way to locate a building on the earth. It also uses framework of metalwork like we saw in some earlier projects as the structure for it. Obviously it's clad and really kind of reaps the benefit of all the decorative aspect, but polychromy, variety of colors. It's just the theater created by architects. Gilded bronze, marbles and stones. I think the facade of the building has different kinds of materials, up to 17, 20 different materials just on the skin of the building itself. Marble friezes, columns, statuary, just to portray elements of Greek mythology on the skin of the building. So you know you're in for an event when you show up on the outside. So we'll come back to this space now and we'll give a little bit of definition to making sure this isn't read like a curtain's been pulled down. And we'll show coming off of these arches, there's a spring point from each of these that crosses the room and then comes down. So it's a bit darker on that side. So you can build a little bit of volume back in there by showing some movement. There may be an excuse to do over here as well, just a little bit to tie that down, but not too much information because our subject's in the foreground here. If you like, you can come up here on the rim and you could put the height of a person leaning over that edge of that balcony to give some scale of that height up there. And now we'll do some of the closer detail. The balustrade here it's really sort of encased in the mass of the structure. So it comes down with its top rail and the bottom piece and simply has a repetition of the movement of the balusters coming down, and they'll get ever so slightly spaced out more. So when we come right to the bottom, you might be able to see a little space between them, but they're so closely packed in. It's more that just sort of lineal pattern there. And then what helps to make the bottom stairs seem more significant, as you come down, this pours out in a lower level so that you can make on the edge of your pencil a little bit of a darker tone, as if there's a cast shadow coming over from the lip of the tread nose itself, casting onto the plate of the stair. And then it becomes more of a line itself and eventually dissipates to gray so that the top third of the stair is just a tone rather than a whole series of steps. Now I'll come over to our column because we want it to read round. And so this is our sort of, again, pattern language for drawing things that are cylindrical in space. Now we know that the least amount of light is on the back side of it, probably more coming from this space onto this right side. So we'll take that, again, the column coming down and projecting a cast shadow on here. And as it rolls around and sees less light, there's that hyperbolic arc. So we can treat that side a little bit darker. And then it helps both of these, and the opposite happens over here, kind of sit in space more as if light's projecting on them. We'll take that all the way down to the base until it finally meets the stairs splaying out. And that kind of regular pattern there, down to the grade. Into the flooring. So we'll chase some of the baluster moving upstairs here before we lose it going behind. There's a piece of heraldic detail sculpture right there. It's kind of abstract here, but it's going to block our view of the rail going all the way to the second floor. But we can do that same kind of pattern and then kind of lighten it as it goes up, just to continue the idea that as the stair is going to wrap around. We'll do the same over here. About halfway through the baluster stops. So this is getting further away from our access point visually, the distance just a little bit. And that way your perceiver here is putting the space together in terms of the language of the architecture. When we through the space, see through the two stairs towards the right wall here, the way we started here, it carries over on this plane, and there's an opening over here. And that'll show some depth there. It's got a base to it, and that projects on the other side here. So if you carry it through, the sketch is going to end soon enough, but it's nice to kind of carry those lines through there and then drop them down and try to stop until a repetition of that happens. But this ends up being a darker value into that next room adjacent to this space. And that helps kind of fill that out. And then the last thing you have to do is just sort of, as we kind of squint and see our value arrangement, we know where we want to hold our whites now, the white areas from the outside to this skin being lit to being light thrown on this column. Now we want to make sure we push the grays to 80%, 9% black. So one of the key points in the center of our sketch will be making this also a rotunda. So the darker stone here on this pedestal will be brighter on one side and become darker and darker, where it loses the sense of light on that side of it and then drops down to the base. And that's part of our key third of the subject, so that's good. And then here's our first piece of sidewall that ends up being beneath the arch. So we'll take that whole zone here and make that darker and darker. And then take that down to an even darker level now at the base of this to show the least amount of light is at the base of this column. So now we're pushing it, just like Garnier is pushing people on really lovely classical undulating forms. Nothing's too rectilinear in the plan, so the movement is fluid in terms of human involvement. The light's doing the same thing then. So we want to wash it to a point of darkness and move it to a point where we trap it against a nice white tone. Same is true up here. As this comes down, it's going to get darker and darker and darker until we get to our spring point of that column. We can wrap that darkness that we had here over into this side of the arch. And then because it's very bright on the other side of the stair, that flying arch that celebrates that stair up above will appear darker. So that's a good place to put some of the dark tone as well. I think these columns are far enough away. We don't have to do too much with rotation, maybe just the necking before we get to the column capitals, which obviously here are kind of a composite between Corinthian and Ionic. Really decorated, really elaborate detail there. And then perhaps in the shadows here, there could be yet more people as you kind of animate this space, looking over in groups on these little terrace seating areas, lookout areas over the space. And what's nice, because it's off the nights of the actual opera, it's obviously a big tourist attraction, and there's so many there, you feel like you're actually at an event, because it's very difficult to ever find this space without the general public in it, whether it's for a performance or just people seeing the architecture. And the rest is just time really on our hands, because we could keep going in detail for the next couple of hours, couple of days, couple of weeks, couple of years, and never reach the actual detail that's inherent in this Garnier place, because it really is the absolute jewel of the empire from that time period. It had a very sort of tumultuous end in terms of Napoleon, because by the time 1870s roll around, he's out of power, and yet another republic is installed after the plight of the Prussian War that happened in the 1870s. So a mix of places here, actually the pinnacle of the École des Beaux-Arts in terms of its language of architecture. At one point, the wife of the Napoleon is quoted as saying, this might be more storified version, but came to Garnier, and when he saw the drawings and saw it coming out, she was concerned that this wasn't a style she knew. It wasn't Louis XIV. It didn't have the markings of Louis XV, not even Louis XVI. So what could this possibly be? And then he dictated back to her really quickly, Madame, this is Napoleon III architecture. So that stylistic idea of Napoleon III really is the Second Empire. And so that actually is a term in architectural history, particularly in French architectural history, that's adopted in the East Coast of the United States. You can find Second Empire versions where everything is kind of this eclectic look of a variety of different shapes and forms, because now architecture really is studied in a classroom with textbooks and images and the ability to see drawings of old buildings from many myriads of styles and periods. And that's at the pencil point of architects at the time. So it's very in vogue to blend these things. So eclectic is not a pejorative term. It really is a celebration of the history of architecture, and the best architects, the craftiest, are the ones that can blend them together and kind of pull off new versions of masterpieces. So before we step away from this lecture, I'll show you another piece that we're going to also walk by early in the summer, where it's a great eclectic use of language by another celebrated architect that actually practiced a lot in structural engineers as well. And this is Saint Augustine. And so when we come to St. Augustine, it's got a couple of really cool ideas all immersed on a site. The first is because they're designing the city, Baron Haussmann designing the city to have boulevards. And the boulevards will splay out and create ideas for space that are unusual. So in this case, he commissioned a church and had, working with Napoleon, to do a new Catholic church for a growing parish as an extension away from the Opera House. And it's on a site that actually is a bit of a trapezoid for the architecture. So the architecture itself in plan type, if you look at this, actually splays out on the first floor. Then its vault ends up being sort of early Christian. Its front piece is a three-doored Romanesque facade with a sculpturally, the Kings of Judea sculpted, and up above a rose window from the Gothic era. So even on the facade itself, it's got 3 or 4 styles. In plan type, the plan type is generated because of the urban plan that came before it. It has a Renaissance dome on the top, and the building itself, which you don't see from this model, but you will when you go inside of it, is lightweight metal on the interior. And it's exposed just like Saint-Janvier Bibliothèque was in our last sketch. So it's got this light, airy elegance and a really kind of crafty way to use the eclectic language of various times in history to pull off a one-of-a-kind church, which just extends this language of the École des Beaux-Arts blending high technology with history as a pattern language in the city of Paris.